I found the admission records in a psychiatric hospital archive outside Vienna. Documents from 1852 that shouldn't have been preserved because they revealed too much. Patient intake forms, listing dozens of individuals committed that year, with diagnosis codes that made no sense. Not melancholia or mania or any recognized psychiatric condition, just a single notation repeated across multiple files. Historical delusion with confabulatory elements. The symptoms described in the intake notes were identical across patients. Claims of remembering cities that looked different. Insistence that buildings had been buried, descriptions of technologies that supposedly no longer existed, memories of events that official records said never happened, and most tellingly, persistent questioning of why the streets were higher, why basement windows were at ground level, why everyone seemed to have forgotten what things were like before. These weren't psychiatric patients. These were witnesses. Survivors who remembered the old world before the mudflood buried it, and they were being systematically institutionalized to silence their memories and prevent them from contaminating the new narrative being established about what had always been. The pattern appears across Europe and North America in hospital records from the 1840s through 1870s. Sudden, massive increase in asylum admissions. Not gradual growth, matching population increases. Explosive expansion requiring construction of dozens of new psychiatric facilities within a 20-year period. Official explanations point to improved diagnosis and humanitarian treatment, replacing previous neglect of the mentally ill. But the admission records tell different story. They show specific types of patients being institutionalized in unprecedented numbers. Patients whose primary symptoms involved memories that contradicted official history. Patients who insisted things had been different before specific dates in the early 1800s. Patients who described architectural features and social structures that supposedly never existed. Patients who questioned why no one else seemed to remember what they remembered. These weren't people suffering from psychiatric illness. These were people suffering from memory. From knowing things they weren't supposed to know. From refusing to forget what authorities needed forgotten. The diagnosis itself was weaponized. Historical delusion appeared in psychiatric manuals from the 1840s forward, describing condition where patients insisted on false memories of past events. The treatment recommendations were clear. Institutional confinement, isolation from family and community. Re-education through repetitive correction of false memories. Physical restraints if patient persisted in expressing delusional historical beliefs, and crucially, permanent records marking the individual as unreliable witness whose testimony about anything should be disregarded. Once diagnosed with historical delusion, everything you said became suspect. Every memory became evidence of ongoing illness. Every insistence that you remembered things differently became proof you needed continued institutionalization. The diagnosis was perfect weapon for eliminating inconvenient witnesses, for ensuring that survivors of the mudflood catastrophe who remembered the old world would never be able to share those memories credibly with younger generations who had no direct experience of what was lost. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. The asylum expansion begins exactly when we've documented the final major mudflood events. Institutions constructed in the 1840s and 1850s showing capacity far exceeding any reasonable projection of psychiatric need. Buildings designed to house thousands of patients in cities with populations of tens of thousands, as if authorities anticipated needing to institutionalize significant percentage of populations. And the patient intake records show exactly that. In cities affected by documented mudflood events, asylum admission rates in the years immediately following the catastrophe reached 5 to 10% of the adult population. Not people showing obvious psychiatric distress. People who told inconvenient stories. People who remembered things that conflicted with the new official narrative. People who needed to be removed from society before their memories spread to others, who might begin questioning the massive environmental and historical changes that had occurred. The specific symptoms listed in the medical files are revealing because they're so consistent and so specific. Patients reported remembering street levels being lower, remembered entering buildings at ground level that now required descending stairs, remembered architectural features that had supposedly been destroyed centuries ago but which patients insisted existed until recently, remembered technologies and social practices that official history placed in distant past or claimed never existed, and perhaps most damning, remembered family members and community members who had disappeared during the catastrophe, but whose deaths were never officially recorded. The asylum records document these memories, then dismiss them as delusional. But read carefully, they're documenting actual testimony of what the old world was like before it was buried. They're preserving evidence, even while labeling it insane, and they're showing systematic pattern of institutionalizing anyone who remembered too clearly and spoke too openly about what they'd witnessed. If you're starting to question whether psychiatric institutions were used as tools for historical erasure, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me if you've ever been told you're crazy for remembering something that others insist never happened. Because what I'm about to show you proves that psychiatric diagnosis has been weaponized for centuries to silence inconvenient truths and eliminate witnesses to events authorities want forgotten. The asylum architecture itself tells the story. The institutions built in the 1840s through 1860s weren't designed like previous hospitals or charitable facilities. They were designed like prisons. High walls, locked doors, isolation cells, guard towers in some cases, minimal windows, heavy construction designed for security, not healing, and capacity far exceeding psychiatric need, unless you anticipated massed institutionalization rather than treatment of genuinely ill individuals. The Vienna Asylum, where I found those records, was built in 1848 with capacity for 2,000 patients in a city of 400,000. That's one facility designed to house half of 1% of the population. Similar ratios appear across Europe, as if someone calculated that approximately that percentage of populations would need to be removed and held permanently after the catastrophe. The architecture was built for containment, not care, for silencing, not healing, for ensuring that certain memories died with the people who held them rather than being passed to subsequent generations. The treatment protocols reveal the intent. Standard psychiatric treatment of the era involved various therapies attempting to relieve symptoms, but patients diagnosed with historical delusion received different treatment: isolation from all outside contact, including family visits, prohibition on discussing their memories with other patients or staff, forced repetition of official historical narratives until they demonstrated acceptance, punishment for persisting in expressing memories that contradicted approved history, and most tellingly, patients who recanted their memories and acknowledged they'd been delusional were often released relatively quickly, while those who maintained their memories remained institutionalized for years or decades. The treatment wasn't trying to cure illness. It was trying to eliminate memory. Was using institutional confinement as tool for forced historical amnesia. Get with the program, accept the new narrative, denounce your memories as false, and you could leave. Maintain that you remembered things differently and you stayed locked up until you died or broke. The family separation was particularly cruel and effective. Once someone was institutionalized for historical delusion, family members were discouraged from maintaining contact. Were told that exposure to the patient's delusions might be contagious, were warned that maintaining relationships with diagnosed individuals put their own sanity at risk. This isolated the witnesses not just physically but socially, prevented them from sharing their memories, even with their own children and grandchildren. Within a generation, the memories died with the institutionalized individuals because they'd been cut off from everyone who might have preserved and transmitted their testimony, and the families who initially knew their relatives weren't insane, who knew the memories were real. Those families faced social pressure to accept the diagnosis, to avoid being associated with insanity themselves, to participate in forgetting rather than risk being labeled as sharing the delusion. The social mechanisms reinforced the institutional mechanisms, ensuring comprehensive erasure of inconvenient memories. The documentation shows the psychiatric establishment knew exactly what they were doing. Internal hospital correspondence discusses the need to protect social order by preventing destabilizing historical claims from spreading, describes the importance of institutional authority in maintaining accepted narratives. references coordination with civil authorities to identify individuals requiring intervention before their influence became problematic. This wasn't medical practice. This was political operation using medical institutions as cover, and it was remarkably effective. Within 20 years of the major Mudflood events, the survivors who remembered the old world were mostly dead or permanently institutionalized. Their children had been taught to dismiss their parents' memories as symptoms of mental illness, and a new generation grew up accepting the buried world as always having been that way because the witnesses to the change had been eliminated or discredited so thoroughly their testimony became literally unbelievable. The patient records sometimes preserve the memories, even while diagnosing them as false. One intake form from 1853 describes a patient who insists he remembers entering his childhood home at street level in 1835, but now must descend 12 steps to reach the same door. The physician notes this as clear evidence of historical delusion because official records show the building's entrance has always been below street level. But the patient's memory is almost certainly accurate. The street level rose during Mudflood events between 1835 and 1850. The entrance that was once at grade became a basement entrance when sediment buried the original ground floor. But acknowledging that would require acknowledging the Mudflood itself, would require explaining how street levels rose by 12 feet or more in 15 years, would require admitting that massive environmental catastrophe had occurred that official records don't adequately document. Easier to diagnose the patient as delusional. Easier to institutionalize the witness than explain the impossible change he accurately remembered. Another record from 1867 describes a woman who insists that a particular church had a tower that disappeared. She remembers the tower existing in the 1840s, provides detailed description. But the church records show no tower was ever constructed. The diagnosis is historical delusion based on confabulating architectural features that never existed. Except the architectural evidence shows that many churches did lose towers during the Mudflood period, shows that towers were sometimes dismantled or collapsed, and the damage was repaired by removing the tower entirely rather than rebuilding. The official church records might have been altered to hide the loss, or the tower might have been eliminated so completely that later documentation simply omitted it. But the patient's memory of the tower probably reflects actual experience. She's being institutionalized for accurately remembering something that authorities decided needed to be forgotten. The diagnosis protects the official narrative by eliminating testimony that contradicts it. The scale of institutionalization suggests this was systematic policy, not organic medical response. Estimates based on asylum capacity and admission records indicate that between 1840 and 1870, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people were institutionalized across Europe and North America for conditions involving historical memory disagreeing with official narratives. That's genocidal scale. That's deliberate elimination of a witness class, not through killing necessarily, but through permanent removal from society and comprehensive discrediting of their testimony. Within a single generation, authorities eliminated the living memory of the pre-Mudflood world by institutionalizing everyone who remembered it too clearly and spoke about it too openly. And they did it under medical cover, under humanitarian claims of treating mental illness, making the operation not just effective, but morally defensible to populations who didn't recognize what was actually happening. Subscribe now and drop a comment about whether you think psychiatric diagnosis could be used today to silence inconvenient witnesses or discredit unwanted testimony. Because what comes next shows exactly how the asylum system was coordinated with other suppression mechanisms and why understanding this history matters for recognizing modern applications of the same tactics. The coordination with other suppression efforts is documented in government records. The same authorities overseeing cartographic revision and historical rewriting were involved in asylum expansion. The same banking families financing the Mudflood cleanup and rebuilding funded asylum construction. The asylum superintendents attended conferences where historical narrative coordination was discussed. This wasn't separate operation. This was integrated campaign. The maps were redrawn to show the new geography. The encyclopedias were revised to reflect the new history. The witnesses who remembered differently were institutionalized, all happening simultaneously, all coordinated to ensure that within 20 years, no credible challenge to the new narrative would exist. The witnesses would be dead or discredited, the documents would support the approved story, and a generation would emerge that accepted the post-Mudflood world as always having been that way because all contradictory evidence had been systematically eliminated. The legal framework supporting this required changes to commitment laws across multiple jurisdictions in the same narrow time frame. Before 1840, institutionalizing someone for psychiatric reasons required fairly stringent evidence of danger or severe incapacity. After 1850, commitment could be achieved based on much vaguer criteria, including beliefs that contradicted accepted knowledge or persistence in expressing ideas deemed socially distinct. The legal changes made it much easier to institutionalize people, not for genuine psychiatric illness, but for political or social inconvenience, and the changes happened simultaneously across nations that supposedly had independent legal systems. That coordination proves the asylum expansion wasn't organic response to medical need. It was planned policy implemented through coordinated legal and institutional changes, designed to facilitate mass removal of inconvenient populations. The pharmaceutical component adds another dimension. Many institutionalized patients receive mercury and other heavy metal treatments ostensibly as therapy, but which had effect of causing actual neurological damage. Patients who entered asylums with intact memories and coherent testimony often developed genuine cognitive impairment. After months or years of mercury treatment, this served dual purposes: degraded the memories authorities wanted eliminated, and created actual psychiatric symptoms that retrospectively justified the patient who initially had no genuine illness, but inconvenient memories became genuinely impaired through toxic treatment, became the mad person that diagnosis initially falsely claimed they were. The medical system didn't just hide the witnesses, it destroyed them, made them actually insane through poisoning disguised as treatment, and eliminated any possibility that they might eventually be released and resume sharing their memories. The asylum staff were carefully selected and trained. Superintendents required political connections and were vetted for loyalty to approved narratives. Physicians were taught specific diagnostic criteria that would identify patients needing historical delusion diagnosis. Orderlies were instructed to report any patient discussions about pre-Mudflood memories or questions about historical inconsistencies. The entire institutional apparatus was designed to reinforce the suppression, to ensure that even within the asylums, patients couldn't share memories with each other, couldn't form communities of witnesses who might support each other's recollections, were kept isolated, were told repeatedly that their memories were false, were punished for maintaining their testimony. This is systematic psychological warfare against memory itself, against the human capacity to maintain knowledge of reality when authorities demand that reality be forgotten. The generational effect was the goal. The institutionalized witnesses would die, their families, taught to see them as insane, wouldn't preserve their memories. Their testimony, officially recorded as symptoms of delusion, would never be taken seriously by historians. Within 40 years, by 1880, virtually everyone with personal memory of the pre-Mudflood world was gone. What remained were people who'd been children during the catastrophe, with vague memories they'd been taught to distrust, and people born afterward who knew only the post-Mudflood world. The historical amnesia was nearly complete. The Mudflood events themselves could be minimized or explained away. The dramatic changes to cities and landscapes could be attributed to gradual development rather than catastrophic burial, and anyone who suggested otherwise could be dismissed as believing conspiracy theories or repeating the delusions of crazy people. The asylum system didn't just silence the witnesses, it poisoned the well, made the testimony itself seem inherently unbelievable by associating it with insanity. The evidence preservation in asylum records was accidental. The institutions were meant to silence witnesses, not document them. But bureaucratic thoroughness meant intake forms recorded the actual testimony even while diagnosing it as delusional. Those records survived in archives that researchers rarely examined because they were filed as medical rather than historical documents. And reading them now, 3 centuries later, they provide extraordinary window into what survivors actually witnessed. They describe the Mudflood in real time, describe the burial of cities, described the chaos and the official response, described the narrative transition as authorities insisted nothing unusual had happened despite visible evidence of catastrophic change. These records were preserved specifically because authorities considered them evidence of insanity rather than evidence of actual events. The very mechanism of suppression inadvertently created archive of suppressed truth. One particularly detailed intake form from 1855 describes a patient's testimony about St. Petersburg. He insists he remembers the Neva River flooding catastrophically in 1842, depositing massive amounts of sediment that buried ground floors across the city. He describes months of cleanup, during which authorities insisted the flooding was routine seasonal variation, describes watching buildings being modified to convert buried ground floors into basements, describes being told by officials that what he witnessed wasn't unusual, and that his insistence otherwise indicated concerning mental instability. By 1855, when he was institutionalized, he'd spent over a decade being gaslit about his own memories, being told what he saw wasn't what he saw, being informed that his direct experience was delusional. The intake physician notes all this testimony, then concludes the patient suffers from persistent historical delusion requiring institutional treatment. But the testimony itself describes exactly what we've documented, describes Mudflood event and official narrative control in real time from witness perspective. Another record from 1869 describes a woman who worked as a teacher before institutionalization. Her testimony is remarkable for its clarity and detail. She describes teaching history in the 1840s using textbooks that included information about Tartarian territories and technologies, describes those textbooks being withdrawn and replaced in the early 1850s, with new editions omitting the Tartarian content, describes questioning the changes and being told the previous information was errors being corrected, describes trying to teach her students about what she remembered from the old textbooks and being warned by administrators to use only approved materials. By 1869, she was institutionalized after continuing to insist that historical facts had been deliberately changed. Her diagnosis: historical delusion with obsessive fixation on textual inconsistencies. But her testimony documents exactly what we've established through examining actual textbook changes. She's describing the historical revision in progress, describing it being implemented in reality, and she's being punished for noticing and speaking about it. The family testimonials included in some intake files provide another layer of evidence. Relatives, explaining why they're seeking commitment, describe the patient's symptoms in terms that reveal the political nature of the institutionalization, insists on contradicting official accounts, refuses to accept corrected historical information, persists in expressing memories that conflict with established facts, influences others with destabilizing claims about the past. These aren't descriptions of mental illness. These are descriptions of dissent, of refusing to accept imposed narrative, of maintaining memory when authorities demand forgetting. The families seeking commitment often express frustration that the patient won't simply accept the new narrative and move on, won't stop questioning, won't let the inconsistencies go unexamined. The institutionalization is being requested not because the family believes the relative is actually insane, but because the relative's persistence creates social problems for the family, creates association with questionable beliefs that threaten the family's standing. The asylum becomes tool for families to dissociate from inconvenient members who won't conform. The release records, where they exist, show the coercion clearly. Patients diagnosed with historical delusion who sought release needed to demonstrate recovery. Recovery was defined explicitly as acceptance of official historical narratives and renunciation of previous claims. The asylum physicians documented the recovery process. Patient initially insistent that memories were accurate. After months of isolation and re-education, beginning to express doubt. After additional treatment, acknowledging possibility that memories were false. After sustained effort, fully accepting that previous beliefs were delusional and committing to not expressing them again. Only then was release considered, and even 10 patients were often required to provide written statements, acknowledging their previous delusions and promising to discourage such beliefs in others. The institutional process was explicitly designed to break memory and enforce narrative compliance. Those who broke were released. Those who didn't stayed until they died. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're recognizing how psychiatric diagnosis can be weaponized to enforce narrative compliance and eliminate inconvenient testimony. Because what I need to show you now is how these same mechanisms operate today in evolved but fundamentally identical forms. The modern psychiatric establishment retains diagnostic tools perfectly suited for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Delusional disorder allows diagnosis of people who maintain beliefs that contradict consensus reality despite being otherwise functional. Sounds reasonable until you recognize that consensus reality is socially constructed and can be manipulated. During the Mudflood era, consensus reality said the catastrophe didn't happen despite visible evidence it did. Anyone who maintained memory of the events despite this consensus qualified as delusional. Today, consensus reality is still socially constructed, still reflects approved narratives maintained through institutional gate, and people who maintain beliefs contradicting that consensus can still be diagnosed as delusional regardless of whether their beliefs are actually accurate. The mechanism hasn't changed. Only the specific beliefs being targeted as delusional have evolved. The involuntary commitment laws that facilitated the asylum expansion still exist in modified forms. Modern commitment requires evidence of danger to self or others rather than just expressing unconventional beliefs. But danger can be interpreted broadly, expressing beliefs that might influence others toward actions authorities consider dangerous, refusing treatment that authorities deem necessary, behavior that disrupts social order even without direct violence. The legal framework allows removal of individuals whose primary issue is refusing to accept approved narratives if their refusal can be framed as dangerous. And once committed, the same dynamic applies. Accept the diagnosis. Take the prescribed medication, demonstrate compliance with approved thought patterns, and eventual release becomes possible. Maintain that you're not ill, that your beliefs are rational, that authorities are wrong, and extended institutionalization follows. The system still rewards compliance and punishes dissent disguised as treating illness. The pharmaceutical evolution makes modern suppression more effective. During the Mudflood era, mercury treatments caused actual neurological damage that retroactively justified the institutionalization. Modern psychiatric medications achieve similar effect with plausible deniability. Antipsychotics that cause cognitive blunting, mood stabilizers that reduce emotional intensity, sedatives that suppress energy and motivation. Patients treated long-term often develop genuine cognitive impairment from the medications, develop dependency on the drugs, become actually disabled where they initially weren't. The treatment creates the condition it claims to address, makes the witness actually impaired, eliminates their credibility, ensures they can never effectively share the testimony that led to their institutionalization. And it's all framed as compassionate medical care rather than political suppression. The social mechanisms remain identical. Families pressured to support commitment of difficult relatives. Communities encouraged to report individuals expressing destabilizing beliefs. Social stigma attached to association with diagnosed individuals. Financial incentives through insurance and disability systems that reward compliance with psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. Professional consequences for questioning psychiatric authority or suggesting diagnoses might be politically motivated. The network of pressures ensures that modern witnesses to suppressed events face the same isolation and discrediting that Mudflood survivors experienced. The tools have evolved, but the strategy remains. Identify people who remember or know things authorities want forgotten, diagnose them as mentally ill, isolate them from social influence, discredit their testimony, and either break them into compliance or permanently remove them from public discourse. The modern perils are everywhere if you look. Witnesses to events that contradict official narratives facing psychiatric evaluation. Whistleblowers diagnosed with personality disorders that conveniently discredit their testimony. Activists involuntarily committed when their activities become too effective. Researchers losing positions after psychiatric diagnosis, following politically inconvenient discoveries. The mechanisms are subtler than the mass institutionalization of the 1800s more irremediable, but fundamentally the same strategy. Use medical authority to silence political dissent. Use psychiatric diagnosis to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Use institutional power to enforce narrative compliance disguised as providing treatment to ill individuals. And it works because populations have been trained to trust medical authority to assume that psychiatric diagnosis reflects genuine illness rather than recognizing it can be a weapon for eliminating dissent. The historical amnesia about the asylum suppression is itself evidence of ongoing control. Most people don't know psychiatric institutions were used for mass elimination of Mudflood witnesses. Don't know historical delusion was diagnosis specifically created for silencing inconvenient memories. Don't know the asylum expansion of the 1840s-1860s corresponded to catastrophic events. Authorities needed forgotten that history has been buried as thoroughly as the Mudflood itself, which allows the same tactics to be used today without populations recognizing them. Without people seeing that psychiatric diagnosis of politically inconvenient individuals isn't new development but centuries-old strategy, the suppression suppresses knowledge of itself, makes its own history invisible, ensures each generation thinks psychiatric authority is purely medical rather than recognizing its political functions. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what I need you to understand is that recovering Mudflood history requires recognizing that witness testimony was systematically eliminated through psychiatric institutionalization, and that understanding those suppression mechanisms helps us recognize when they're being used today. The asylum records that survive are precious because they preserve testimony that was meant to be destroyed. The intake forms documenting memories before diagnosing them as false. The treatment notes recording persistence of forbidden knowledge. The family testimonials revealing the political motivations for commitment. All of this survived because institutions are bureaucratic and paperwork persists even when the purpose of the paperwork is forgotten. We can now read the testimony of Mudflood survivors in their own words, can see what they witnessed, can understand what was buried, along with the cities, can recognize the coordination between environmental catastrophe and historical revision, and can see the human cost, the thousands institutionalized, the families destroyed, the memories eliminated, the testimony discredited, all to ensure that official narrative would prevail over lived experience. What we learn from this history is that narrative control requires eliminating witnesses, requires ensuring that people who remember differently either recant or are removed from influence. The Mudflood authorities understood this, used psychiatric institutions as tool for comprehensive witness elimination, succeeded so thoroughly that within 40 years, the catastrophe was mostly forgotten, and the changes it caused were accepted as always having been that way. We're living with the results of that success, living in cities with buried ground floors that we call basements. Walking on street levels raised during events we're taught were gradual development, accepting historical narrative that omits the catastrophe entirely. And we accept it because the witnesses were silenced, because the testimony that would contradict official story was diagnosed as insanity and locked away until it could be safely ignored. But the testimony survived in the archives. Survived in intake forms and treatment notes filed as medical records, but actually documenting suppressed history. We can recover those memories now, can recognize that the diagnosed delusions were accurate witness accounts, can see that the patients weren't insane but inconvenient, can understand that psychiatric authority was used to eliminate truth rather than treat illness, and recognizing this history helps us see the same patterns operating today. Helps us recognize when psychiatric diagnosis is being used to silence rather than help, when institutional authority serves political purposes rather than medical ones, when compliance is being enforced through diagnosis of dissent as illness. The Mudflood survivors who were sent to asylums weren't crazy. They were witnesses. They saw the catastrophe, remembered the old world, refused to forget when authorities demanded amnesia, and they were systematically eliminated for that refusal. Their testimony was preserved accidentally by the very institutions that silenced them, preserved in records that document both the truth they tried to tell and the suppression they suffered for telling it. We owe them recovery of that truth, owe them acknowledgement that they were right, and the authorities who institutionalized them were engaged in mass suppression of historical reality, owe them recognition that psychiatric diagnosis was weaponized to eliminate their testimony. And we owe ourselves understanding that the same weapon is still available. Still used, still effective at silencing inconvenient truths by diagnosing them as symptoms of illness. The asylums buried memories as effectively as the Mudflood buried cities. Both operations were necessary for the historical revision to succeed. Both were coordinated aspects of comprehensive suppression campaign, and both succeeded so thoroughly that we're still living with the results. Still accepting the revised history, still unaware of what was lost, still trusting institutional authority that was complicit in the erasure. But the evidence survived. The asylum records preserve the testimony even while trying to discredit it, and we can read that testimony now, can hear the voices of the witnesses, can understand what they saw and why they needed to be silenced, can recognize that their insanity diagnosis was the insanity, that the real madness was the systematic elimination of truth in service of political narrative, that the genuine illness was the institutional decision to bury both the physical evidence and the human memory of catastrophic change. The Mudflood survivors sent to asylums weren't sick. They were sacrificed to maintain the lie. And recovering their testimony means exposing that lie and recognizing the mechanisms that maintained it then and maintain other lies.